Joining me right now is former U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Wilbur, it's great to have you this morning. Thanks so much for being here. I know you've got a lot to talk about in terms of your SPAC, which has been so successful. But let me start on China, Secretary, because you and your colleagues in the Trump administration did so much to try to keep China and the Communist Party accountable for bad behavior. Your reaction to what took place this last weekend with regard to the meeting in Alaska between the CCP and the State Department officials?
Well, I think both countries were trying each other on for size. We started out with Secretary Blinken taking a very stiff point of view, I think a correct point of view against China, and then they came back with very strong rebuttal. So now we had the first set of word games. The real question is, will there be follow-through? Will they continue the tough measures that we put into effect on China? I was encouraged by my successor, the new Secretary of Commerce, making a very strong statement after meeting with the Semiconductor Industry Association. She seems to be very much in favor of our government helping them. And that's important because tariffs do one thing, which is to buy some time so you can build up American industry. But the real answer, we must have strong and competitive American companies who can be exporters. In terms of semiconductors, we now are down to a 12% share of global production of semiconductors, and yet we consume about half the semiconductors in the world. So we're a net importer of semiconductors. And the reason is we don't have the fabricating capability. There's a bill pending that has support from Senator Schumer, I believe has support from Pelosi, to put something like $37 billion into research and development and contribute toward new fabricating facilities in the U.S. That's the kind of thing we need to reposition ourselves longer term.
Yeah, I think you make some really important points, especially about semiconductors, because these are the areas that the CCP wants to beat America. And quantum computing is one of those areas that people are worried about.
Sure.
If they beat us in quantum computing, they will be able to break codes and understand the U.S.'s strategy on a lot of levels. The Journal this morning is out with an op-ed on the Alaska meeting, and the Wall Street Journal writes, this is a dangerous moment as the world's rogue powers look to test the Biden administration's resolve. The Anchorage lecture is a warning to take seriously, writes the Journal this morning. Wilbur, your thoughts on what this means in terms of testing the administration? Let's face it, on the way out, the CCP put sanctions on people like Mike Pompeo, Peter Navarro, other people from the Trump administration. That was the beginning of the test for the Biden administration.
Well, perhaps so. I think it was more tit for tat in that we had put sanctions on a number of high Chinese officials. So I think that was just going back and forth. But it isn't just China who's testing the Biden administration. You notice shortly after Biden put a hold on arms shipments to Saudi Arabia, suddenly the Houthis start shooting missiles and drones into the Saudi oil fields. That's another kind of a test. So it's Iran, it's China, and it's Russia. Those all three in sequence are going to be trying us on. I hope he stands as firm as the words were in Alaska. And if he does and he backs it up with actions, then I think things will settle down because they will probe for weakness.
Yep. Well, you're right, and we're going to keep spotlighting this. Let's turn to your SPAC. This is Ross Acquisition Corp. on the New York Stock Exchange, listed for $10 a share. The Ross Acquisition Corp. Planning to sell 30 million units at $10 a share. How's it going? What does it say about the larger trends in the SPAC landscape? I know you've seen great interest from investors, Wilbur.
Well, our SPAC, like most of them, we filed with $300 million as the target amount, but the underwriters were permitted to increase that by 45 million if there was enough demand. Turned out there was plenty of demand, so they actually increased the offering to 345 million. So we were very happy with that. It was good market reception to my return to Wall Street. Semiconductors, in fact, are one of the industries that we've targeted for our SPAC, and others are artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and renewable matters. So we're trying to deal in the things that we view as being very important to the future of the country. More generally,
no, these are all very
SPACs. Yep. Yeah, more generally, SPACs have become a huge phenomenon. 70% of all the recent initial public offerings have been SPACs. And the amount of SPACs raised went from under 20 billion in 2019 to about 73 billion in 2020, sorry. And so far in 2021, in the first few months, is more than the entire total for all of last year, another 70-odd billion. So between last year and this year, it's about 150 billion between last year and this year. So that's a lot of firepower out there. Question is it too much? And is too much of it in the hands of people who are not experienced and who are liable to overpay or buy things at a too early stage of development when it's hard to forecast what the revenues and earnings might be?
Yeah, so you've got to be thinking about that question as well. Wilbur, how does it work? You decide the industries you want to target, and then you look to identify companies, private companies within those areas, whether it be semiconductors or electric vehicles or AI, and then acquire those companies, taking them public in the process.
Yes, what happens is the consideration that a SPAC gives to the private entity is a combination of the cash that's in the SPAC, in our case 345 billion, plus the issuance of shares. So it's very often the case that the private owner ends up with half or maybe even more than half the equity in the combined company. In addition, there's a relatively new phenomenon called PIPEs, private investment in public equity. And there are institutions, many of which are our shareholders now, who buy into the SPAC in the hope that it will need more funding to do a larger deal later on. And so they're there to get acquainted, to be on the scene, and play a role with giving the SPAC more money so that it can do a bigger deal.
Really fascinating stuff, Wilbur. Congratulations on this incredibly successful SPAC. We'll be watching your acquisitions in the future. Good to see you this morning, Wilbur. Thank you.